Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're going to get started in a few minutes. I just want to make sure I've got everything uploaded for today's show.
This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to today's show. You're tuned into the One Human Nation show, and I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. And as a friendly reminder, the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So you've probably heard about the term white man's burden. This show is going to kind of give us some historical perspective on that and where that kind of originated from in actually the roots of Christianity. And then we're going to talk about how that has morphed into really being the black man's burden and something referred to as code switching. So if those are terms that you would like to learn more about as we continue our journey through race reconciliation and what that means, remember the point of this show is really twofold. It's for people that want to share their stories about race and racism. So there are times that I'll have a guest on the show, or it could be multiple guests, and they're talking about their experiences with race and racism. Or it can be like a learning show where we're learning about topics, which is what we're going to be doing today, is kind of really focusing on, when people say, well, why can't we just get past it? Why can't we just get beyond it? I'm so tired of talking about race and racism. I mean, it was a long time ago. Why do we continue having these types of, why does this dialogue continue? Why does it keep being brought up? The simple, and I guess it's not so simple, it's rather complicated. I think it's because we've never really reconciled with the whole episode of race and racism in this country. So it's left a stain, not to mention what happened with the Native Americans, indigenous people that were already here before, even before slaves. So it's not going to go away until we reconcile. So we're going to start by listening to a clip that really introduces us to the white man's burden, and it takes us back to the history of the British colonies and their colonization focused on India. So let's take a listen and see what we can learn, starting with the white man's burden.
The early part of the 19th century, the idea that Britain had a duty to communicate to those subject to its rule the blessings and benefits of the European condition held a wide currency. Britain's imperial purpose, it was argued, was not simply the grubby pursuit of profit, but rather a commitment to bring light into the darkest corners of the world. Britain had to embrace the responsibilities of empire, to which it had been called by Providence. These wide expression in the missionary movement abroad and the anti-slavery campaign at home, both underpinned by the belief that the great mass of mankind could and would be transformed.
I think evangelical Christianity has an important impact on attitudes towards race. And I think there is the first half of the 19th century attitude which is in some ways idealistic and also rather unrealistic. I think there is the hope that as they, the other, black and brown others, become subject to British rule, the civilizing mission, the impact of Christianity, they will gradually, somehow, by some magic, turn into brown and black Englishmen and women. I think there's an enormous evangelical hope that that will happen.
The sort of high point of universalist thinking, of the kinds of thinking which was, we are all the same, we can all become the same. And what underpinned that was that everybody can become like us. I mean, that was really what was imagined in the abolition campaigns. We are brothers under the skin, and the skin doesn't matter. But the skin did matter. And the problem is that after emancipation, when it became clear that emancipated Africans were not going to fit quite as easily into a picture of industrious, hard-working, domesticated men and women, which was what the abolitionists had imagined, then a sense of disappointment, a sense of economic failure, arguments begin to emerge about how emancipation hasn't worked, it's an experiment that hasn't worked. And what goes with that is new ways of articulating the differences between peoples that can no longer rest on, the problem is slavery. Now there has to be something else. So the problem is civilization. The problem is, these forms of barbarism which are still there. And they are, of course, associated also with skin and bones and hair and all those things. So there's a physical aspect to it. But I don't think that biological notions of race are the key to it. I think that it's a civilizational index which is really critical.
Abolitionists were increasingly on the defensive over the question of emancipation in the West Indies. Those public men who had always opposed the abolition of slavery now became more forthright in their opinions. Events in the Caribbean demonstrated, it was claimed, the essential inferiority of black people. They were born to be mastered and had only been briefly lifted out of barbarism by their enforced enslavement and encounter with Europe. Whilst the empire's white subjects might be capable of self-government, those colonies with substantial black populations were not. Those optimistic, progressivist, and for that matter arrogant British ideas about how empire was going to develop were dealt a further blow by a series of events in the colonies. The so-called Indian Mutiny of 1857 and the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865, both dramatic rejections of British authority, forced missionaries and their supporters to recognise that colonial rule was not a simple matter at all. The empire's non-white subjects were perhaps less men and brothers, but rather children who needed responsible and at times forceful parents. Although there was no doubting Britain's civilisational superiority, the extent to which British rule could transform, however gradually, the races or peoples under its care was a contested issue. "Let us take the Negro as we find him," announced the Speaker at a meeting of the Anthropological Society of London in 1866. As God designed him, not a white man, nor the equal of a white man. For those who believed all peoples were the descendants of Adam and Eve, the differences between races could be explained by differences in culture and climate. This didn't mean that all were equal, but given the chance and the right conditions, the level of civilization attained by European culture might be reached by all. At the same time, there were those who focused on ideas of permanent physical difference and inherited characteristics, to explain the fundamental differences between peoples. These two discourses on race, that of cultural differentialism and that of biological racism, were both used to uphold racial hierarchies that progressed from savagery to civilization and ultimately featured white Anglo-Saxons at their apex. They were perhaps not two different systems, but rather racism's two registers.
There's no doubt that various scientific developments during the 19th century feed into a set of arguments about race. The argument can be overstated, however. There are lots of different factors go into making racial arguments, and evolutionary claims post-Darwin can be used for completely contradictory and conflicting political visions. So, for example, you've got social Darwinists who thought that the main lesson that could be learned from Darwin's work was that the races of the world are going to end up in perpetual conflict with one another, and that the strongest would win out in the long run. Deeply pessimistic, racist, competitive view could also be used to support unfettered capitalism and a variety of other social practices and institutions. At the same time, you had people like Prince Kropotkin, anarchists, arguing that the lesson to be learnt from evolution was that human harmony was natural and that cooperation was what was ordained by nature. So even if we take the lessons that were drawn from evolution, they're politically indeterminate and conflicting.
Scientific developments certainly played a role, but not for everyone. You didn't and don't need to believe in an evolutionary theory to be a racist. Ideas of racial hierarchy had existed prior to the 19th century, but had been supported by philosophical and religious rather than scientific arguments. The growth of pseudo-scientific racial theories were tributaries that fed into an existing stream of racial thinking in the later 19th century and gave it new form.
There's no doubt that at least some people, including some very prominent people, did think that science now legitimated views about race and human society. Science has huge cultural authority. It does now and it did then. And to be able to make arguments about social life, and in particular ones about the relations between peoples, between cultures, and to dress this in the language of science, is to make a very powerful ideological claim, one that is extremely effective in shaping the way that people think about the nature of the world.
The idea that certain races, certain groups of people, were living, expanding communities, whilst others were failing, dying ones, could and did shape relationships between coloniser and colonised. In Australia, most strikingly, interaction with Aborigines was often underpinned by a grim, self-consoling conviction that it didn't matter too much how these people were being treated, because they were a race doomed to die out anyway. Although the belief in the essential unity of mankind still remained a powerful one for some people, by the end of the 19th century, the negative representation of other races or peoples as inferior to white Britons could be found in many different cultural forms.
If you look at the outpouring of children's literature, the books for boys, books for girls, in the latter part of the 19th century, they almost always back that line up. So do school textbooks, by the way. They back the line up that black and brown people, particularly black people, are inherently inferior, more or less incapable of improvement, that they will sort of hobble around in the lower depths of colonial society, and they will do some menial jobs and they will be useful, but they can never really aspire to the heights reached by white men and women. And that's probably beyond their capability. And that is, I think, sort of an unspoken understanding which gains enormous currency through literature for children, literature for grown-ups even. Look at John Buchan's, a lot of John Buchan's writing towards the end of the 19th, early 20th century, in which Jews and blacks and other people are sort of written off as, inferior, basically. And I think that seeps into society. School textbooks talk about the hopeless delinquency of the freed slave in the Caribbean. They just write people off. And I think that has a drip impact on young people being educated, because from 1870, after the Forced Education Act, almost every child is educated at least up to the age of 11 or 12. That wasn't happening before, and they're being subjected often. They may have liberal teachers, but the school textbooks are frequently illiberal.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. And so we're kind of unpacking, how do we get here from, blacks, particularly African Americans, slaves, because of the color of their skin. How do we get beyond that? And I think part of it, the reason it's such a huge problem is it's intentional to keep the divide going. It's a good distraction to throw out the race card, and has nothing to do with, it's not just one political party or one agenda. It's really a bigger picture when you start looking at how the economics really work in this country. In many ways, you need a lower class. And if you can easily identify this lower class as because they're black or the color of their skin, it makes it easier. And these, I would say, unconscious biases that we have are going to continue until we take a look at, what's going on within ourselves. It takes an intention to get beyond that point, and it takes a certain amount of bravery to get beyond that point, because it requires you to take a deeper look at what's going on that is impacting our ability to even communicate. I see some things that, kind of percolate on Facebook, and it's like, well, you're not going to be able to communicate via Facebook. That's just not going to happen. And until we realize that, we're going to continue to have this disconnect. So as we continue with this, what was really interesting to me as I was researching this is, how the literature of the day, of that time, supported this whole concept of the white man's burden. So I want you to take a listen to a poem by Rudyard Kipling. And I'm going to confess, I was an English major, and it wasn't until later, much later after college, that I even associated this poem with him. So let's take a listen.
So let's talk about Rudyard Kipling and the poem "The White Man's Burden," which starts on page 1880 and goes to 1882. So Kipling, probably more than any other author, shaped the way that the British saw India and understood India. Kipling himself was Anglo-Indian, which means that he was born in India, but his parents were British. He was raised sort of going back and forth between Britain and India. A lot of his schooling was done in Britain, but whenever he could, he came back to India because he preferred India to Britain. And he wrote, he became famous at quite a young age for his stories about India. So other than The White Man's Burden, probably his most famous text is probably The Jungle Book, although it may be the most famous because Disney made a film about it. But stories about the Anglo-Indians and about Indian nobility, Indian working classes, and so on and so on, really shaped the way that the British understood India and understood themselves as the colonizers of India. Kipling is complex in the way that he presents Indians in his stories, because one of the problems with a lot of Victorian writers who write about the colonies, so people like H. Rider Haggard, who wrote King Solomon's Mines, for instance, one of the problems with a lot of Victorians who write stories about the colonies is they have a tendency to present colonized subjects very racistly, is the simple way to say it. They're presented as these sort of ignorant savages. They're presented as sort of unappreciative, a threat to Western civilization, whatever it is, or a threat to civilizing efforts and things like this. And Kipling sometimes falls into this trap, but he's much more balanced, and he's much more fair in his depiction of colonized peoples, of Indians, both of the Indian ruling class and of the Indian working class, than a lot of other colonial writers are. The white man's burden is something of an exception to this. The white man's burden is a major problem for anyone who wants to see Kipling in a positive light today. Because we live in a post-colonial era, so we live in an era in which people have sort of identified a lot of negative characteristics of colonialism. And it's no longer, like, imperialism is no longer thought to be a good thing. It is in fact thought to be, and I think this as well, imperialism is in fact thought to be sort of terribly oppressive of colonial peoples, and a more or less systematic attempt to erase colonized cultures. Kipling's poem says almost the exact opposite. So Kipling spends a lot of time in this poem chronicling or suggesting all of the things that colonizers do on behalf of the colonized. So he's talking about stopping these sort of local conflicts between different.
So I'm going to stop that right there. I didn't realize it took him this long to get into the actual reading of the poem. So fortunately, I printed it out ahead of time. So let me read you the portion of this poem that he is referring to about taking up the burden of empire that had Britain and other European nations kind of embracing this. And then, later on, Theodore Roosevelt, soon to be vice president, president, described it as a rather poor poetry, but good sense from the expansion point of view. So, you can kind of see why this attitude of colonization from the people that were leaving because they were being suppressed and they want a better life in America, they were bringing this type of attitude with them. So here is the poem, The White Man's Burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and while your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Interesting, huh? So, that kind of brings us to what we're going to transition into, which is how did then this become the black man's burden? How did we transition through slavery and are still dealing with some of the same issues that we're going to talk about? But before we do that, we're going to take a short break to make some announcements, starting with our station identification.
This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
Hello, I'm Rob Hessler.
And I'm David Laughlin.
Join us for 300 and Under, a group art show featuring work by 40 artists, many of whom have been featured on our show, Art on the Air, which airs Wednesdays from 3 to 4 p.m. on WRUU.
This art show is a fundraiser for this all-volunteer nonprofit radio station. The opening reception will be 5 to 8 p.m. on Friday, August 10th, with a wide variety of great talent from our local creative community.
That's at Location Gallery at 417 Whitaker Street. For more information, look for 300 and Under or Location Gallery on Facebook.
Sweetfield of Eden Baptist Church presents the 6th annual Pinpoint Seafood Festival on Saturday, September 15th, from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Pinpoint Avenue near Savannah. This event celebrates the culture of this century-old Gullah Geechee community with music and food. To find out more, find Pinpoint Seafood Festival on Facebook or call 912-596-1337.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're talking about how the white man's burden has transitioned to black people, and specifically, I do want to make this distinction. I'm referring to African Americans that were born and raised in the United States under the bondage of slavery. So if you're a black person that has moved here from another country, whether it's Haiti or Jamaica or wherever, it's different for you. You have a different perspective, and I've talked with different people. You don't have this cloud of slavery and what it has and how it has impacted some people. Now, not everybody thinks in that bondage mentality, but unfortunately, because of how many African Americans have been conditioned, and many not seeing too much changes in their condition because they live in projects and they see the violence every day, and a lot of that I still think is intentional. It's with the war on drugs, and we've talked about this on the show before. So what we're going to transition into talking about is this topic of code switching, and what does that mean when we talk about code switching? So let's take a look at this particular one, and I hope this is the right one I've pulled up. I think it's this person is a senior this year. So this was a clip that I pulled relatively recently from February 2018. And hopefully this is the right one with the high school student.
Good evening. Before we get started, I would like to define two things for you. The first thing I would like to define for you is something called the first 8 rule. I learned the first 8 rule at a life seminar at Emory University over the summer. A woman named Dr. Tolbert told me and my classmates that people often judge you within the first 8 feet, 8 seconds, and 8 words that come out of your mouth. Crazy, right? The second thing I would like to define for you is a term called code switching. Now, people often define code switching as the change in linguistics, but to me, it's more than that. It's the way you dress, the way you talk, the way you present yourself in certain situations. Before I get started, I would like to tell you a little bit about where I'm from and how I learned to code switch. I come from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I went to school in the inner city, or what some consider the hood. We talk different in my city. We dress different on my side of town from others. Oftentimes, I would greet my homegirls with the girl, where you been at? So-and-so party tonight, what's the word, what's the mood? I often spoke with the slang of my city. You perpin', ain't nobody say that. Code for you're lying, nobody just said what you said. I even dressed different. My jeans, my sneakers, Oftentimes, girls wore their head wraps until they got to their destination so the weather wouldn't mess up their do. Then I came to this big switch in my life. I moved to a wealthier part of town, and I started going to school with predominantly white kids. It was a culture shock for me. I wasn't sure how to act. I was always intelligent. I always had manners, but when I never had to display them where I was from. I didn't know what to do. I was in this building full of no one who looked like me. No one had on their scarves. Everyone used these gargantuan lexicons or large vocabularies. I knew I had it, but again, I didn't have to impress the people back on my side of town, so I never used it. They dressed business casually, did things that where I come from, like stare, was not okay. So for weeks, I didn't speak. I didn't say anything. I was afraid of being judged, even though I knew I had it in me. But I didn't want to change who I was just to fit in at this new school. So I went home to my sister, who knows far more about life than I do. And this is where she taught me about code switching. She told me that I didn't have to change who I was as a person, meaning my morals, values, what I stood for, what I found okay and not okay. But sometimes I had to put away my slang and bring out my gargantuan lexicon. Put away my ripped jeans and my head wrap and put on my business suit coat and my khakis and flats. And not to impress them, but to survive in my environment for the time. Basically telling me, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So I did that. I no longer wore my head wrap out of the house. I no longer wore my ripped jeans. I wasn't afraid to answer questions in class and compete for my spot. I used my gargantuan lexicon. I code switched. I was always who I was. I just changed my demeanor to fit the situation at hand. Many people code switch. One of our president, Barack Obama. We know that when Barack Obama is up there for a press conference or in front of the American people in his suit and tie, he is going to get it done. He is about his business. Then we know that side of Obama where he's relaxed, where the ball players come to his house, his leather jacket. Yo, bro, it's cool. Yeah. We know that he can relate to us. Again, we always knew what Obama stood for, what he found okay, not okay, his morals, his values. We knew it. But he changed his demeanor to fit the situation at hand, aka code switched. Business men and women. You wouldn't go to China with only American customs and expect people to be comfortable or want to do business with you. No, you learn some of their customs. You get comfortable with their way of doing things so that they know you care. You care about us. You want to fit in enough. So yeah, we can do that business with you. Not many people know how to code switch, let alone code switch and be themselves. Bringing you back to that first 8 rule where people often judge you within that first 8 feet, 8 seconds, and 8 words that come out of your mouth. Afraid that changing yourself for that situation at hand might make people feel like you're phony or fake. It's not the case at all. People respect you for trying to fit in, trying to survive in that situation. They don't respect you for being phony. Again, you don't change your morals, your values, what you stand for. You change your demeanor to fit the situation at hand. You code switch. You change your language. You change the way that you dress. It doesn't make you a different person on the inside. It just makes you able to survive, to fit in. Like they say, you can go to the White House and fit in, or the hood and fit in, is what I'm trying to get at. So the next time you find yourself in a brand new situation that you've never been in before, I want you to ask yourself, do I code switch? If so, do I remain myself? Am I happy with what I just did? Did I leave a good impression? Do people know that this is me, regardless of me dressing to fit in their situation or not? I guess what I'm trying to say is to code switch or not to code switch. That's the question. Thank you.
So one of the things about code switching for African Americans is a lot of us just do it intuitively. This is a person that I assume since she was a senior, 18 years old. So she was just learning this because she was in a very different environment and then had to switch to a different culture and to fit in. And that's one of the, I guess, downsides of having segregated schools. Because when you start looking at the public school system and how it's become more and more segregated, do these students know that they're going to need to code switch in order to fit in to this America, to this United States of America, and how their dress for a job is not going to be the same as how they would dress in the hood. So we're going to listen to this clip from someone that moved back to the United States after living in Berlin, and she is African American also.
3 years ago, after moving back from Berlin, I had an experience with local law enforcement. I was living in an old family house at the time, but without a car, so typically, even when I was home, there would be no car out front. One afternoon, as I was going through old memories and moving around what seemed like to be 1,000 boxes, the blinds in my spare room were being shifted to and fro, as I was generally just cleaning out the space. My neighbor, an elderly woman, took it upon herself to be the unofficial neighborhood watch. And so seeing the blinds moving back and forth and no car out front in the driveway, she deduced that my home was being burglarized on a Sunday at noon and called the police. As I continued to clean, I was pretty unaware of what was going on outside of my house, but audible and unfamiliar voices prompted me to pause my cleaning activities and to go outside just to see what was going on. The scene that I encountered when I opened my front door is one that I will never forget. 4 police officers with guns drawn, one pointed directly at me, were surrounding my front porch. "Get out of the house! Hands in the air now!" I froze. Up until this point, I had never actually seen a real live loaded gun this close to me, much less had one pointed in my direction. Now I'm here before you today because I obviously survived that encounter. I was able to collect myself enough to answer questions and prove that I had every right to be in that property. But what if I had not looked like me? What if I had not spoken like me? What if the person who opened the door looked like a thug? Whatever image that pops into your head when I use that word, what if the person who opened the door had not been able to collect themselves in the face of grave danger, confusion, and potentially even death to prove that they had the right to be on that property? What if I had expressed rightful anger for being mistreated by police in my own home? What if I had been a black man instead of a black woman? I raise these questions to illustrate the role that behavior plays as it relates to code switching. As a kid, I was inadvertently forced to learn to code switch, and perhaps in my case, that unintentional education saved my life. Code switching as a concept is really interesting. By definition, it's what happens when people who speak multiple languages alternate between 2 or more, oftentimes within the same phrase or sentence. In a more colloquial sense, code switching is what happens when people reflexively or subtly change the way they express themselves. So for someone like me, and I'm sure many of you all here, I thought up until about 4th grade that y'all was the correct contraction for you all. It was only after some point at around 9 or 10 that I learned that you all was the correct way to address a group of people, and that I should absolutely use you all, not y'all, when addressing important people and situations. As our world continues to be connected through technology of all sorts, apps and the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, I guess code switching makes a lot of sense as people from different backgrounds continue to come into close contact with one another. But when we look more closely at code switching and who's expected to make the switch, we discover a hidden reality. And that reality is that the expectation of code switching threatens true diversity. My first day of third grade was at a new school, as I had recently been accepted to the gifted program, which meant that I would be bused from my neighborhood school of West Side to Tomoka in the next city over. The year was 1992, and so on the first day of class, I proudly donned my favorite Jodeci pleather new boots and my cross-color short set. To say that I stuck out like a sore thumb would be a grave understatement. My new classmates were in polite pastels and ribbons and bows and Kids Gap and Limited 2 fashions. I knew immediately that if I was going to fit in and make friends, I would have to change more than just a few things. So over the course of the next few years, I learned acutely how to do just that. I stopped wearing my Jodeci boots. I started choosing softer colors as opposed to the bright hip-hop colors and fashions that I had chosen previously. I started listening to Green Day, and I eventually learned how to act like my new classmates and eventual friends. Most importantly, though, I learned how to align myself not just so that I fit in, but so that I was culturally compatible. And I didn't know it then, but this is where I learned how to code switch and how to behave and speak in a way that made me a non-threatening person of color. As our society grapples with police brutality and protests against such violence have become synonymous with big brand ad campaigns and pop culture, it's a person's behavior which indicates whether or not they have learned the language of effective code switching. There have been countless instances in recent history where a person's ability or inability to code switch has meant the difference between life or death. Are you all familiar with Henry Louis Gates Jr.? Many people know him as the host of the PBS series Finding Your Roots, and still others may know him as an esteemed Harvard professor. Still others of us may remember him also from a 2009 incident involving Cambridge, Massachusetts police when he was arrested for breaking and entering into his own home. No doubt his ability to articulate and him being who he was and being able to explain the situation led to a relatively okay outcome for him, save the public humiliation of being arrested. For those who opt for authenticity, unapologetically deciding to speak with the accents of their homeland or their grandparents, or to wear their hijab, or to say y'all in the boardroom, there are oftentimes very real consequences that can be felt. Consequences like not getting that promotion because the client wants to speak to someone who sounds American, or being jeered at for wearing symbols of pride from your culture, while other people who appropriate that same culture make the pages of Vogue magazine. Or being told by HR or administration that your natural hair is inappropriate for work or school and will need to be changed to avoid disciplinary action. For those who aren't even deciding against code switching because they haven't learned it, the consequences can be even bigger. When I was a kid, I heard a lot of talk about Oreos. And I'm not talking about the delicious cookie sandwiches eaten best with a glass of milk. But I'm talking about the slang term, which refers to a person who's black on the outside and white on the inside. Kids definitely have a way of putting things plainly. But the concept always made me think a lot about myself, who I was and who I was becoming, where I lived and where my friends lived, the music I listened to at home with friends and family versus the music I was starting to listen to with my new friends at school. Deep down, I always felt like I had to hide certain parts of myself that I knew were still very much me. I had to be careful to not slip and say something too ghetto in front of my new friends, but I had to also be careful to not talk too much about cello or classical music when I was at home. For the person who's expected to code switch, to exist almost simultaneously in 2 or 3 different worlds, constantly presenting a slightly edited version of self, the pressure can be immense. But what if there was just one world where we could all be our true selves? Instead of the brand of diversity which purports that minorities are acceptable provided they behave in a specific way, what about a truer sense of diversity, where people are praised for their uniqueness and the cultural capital they bring to places and situations as opposed to being disciplined or shamed for it? What about an acceptance of different speech patterns, even within our own American lexicon, so that when a person says the word y'all, we appreciate what that might mean about their heritage or their upbringing as opposed to what we think it means about their level of intelligence? Or when we see a person with a hijab or an afro, We embrace the reasons for someone's decision to do or to be something different than we are. I truly believe that most of us think diversity is a good thing. Most of us understand that by exposure to people and places and ideas that are different from us, we actually end up being better, smarter, more compassionate people. But is belief in the goodness of diversity enough? In my professional life, I'm a tech founder, and thanks to biology, I happen to be a Black woman tech founder. My startup journey has been like a roller coaster ride without the seatbelt, similar to most people's. But it's because I've learned the language of code switching and checked some of the boxes that means I get access to some of the opportunities. I chose to be a tech founder because, like most ambitious people, I want to change the world in a positive way, even though the data says, specifically for my demographic, any kind of success in the tech industry is the least likely. In this case, when I speak of success, I mean the ability to raise capital to start, grow, and scale a venture. The National Center for Education Statistics reports that Black women are actually the most educated group in the United States. And a recent article from Fast Company highlights that we're also the largest growing sector of new business owners, with a whopping 265% increase in Black women-owned businesses from 1997 to 2014. Yet, when it comes to who receives the venture capital, particularly in the tech industry, women CEOs get just 2.7%. And women of color CEOs, we get 0.2%, also known as none.
None.
The cost of code switching on society is huge because it means that those of us who belong to minority groups spend a lot more time learning the language of cultural compatibility and less time doing the things that matter to all of us, like living, like spending time with friends and family, like starting successful businesses. As the tides of acceptance change in our nation and cultures continue to shift, I challenge all of us to really give every person, regardless of who they are, the space to really be and exist as their true selves. Because it's only when each of us can really live in our truth that we all gain the incredible benefits of true diversity. Thank you.
So hopefully this has been enlightening to you, because it definitely was something that impacted me, and I didn't even realize it. I started going to a predominantly, well, not predominantly, was an all-white school in second grade. So in first grade, it was an all-black school. In second grade, it was an all-white school. And there was an adjustment that needed to be made. And fortunately, you know, with the kind of background my mom had, and she was a secretary, and she was very focused on us speaking proper English and knowing how to enunciate and spell words. I started code switching at a very young age. And so during the day, you know, going to school, I'm in a white environment and making friends. And so I have to sound like the people that I want to make friends with, and, you know, go through all the adjustments of, you know, why isn't my hair straight like Susie's hair? Or, you know, why can't I do X, Y, Z? Or I can remember a time I asked my dad, because one of the students there, she came riding through our neighborhood and she had a horse that she was riding on. And when she left, and she wasn't there to visit me. I mean, she was just riding through the neighborhood. So I asked my dad, I said, can I have a horse, Daddy? Can I have a horse? And he said, well, I can either feed you or the horse. So it is definitely a different world. It's something for African Americans that I think we do naturally. The problem becomes when we don't realize that we need to code switch, that we don't even know how to do that. So I'm going to try to get in a portion of this last clip, and I can see we're going to be running out of time, so I probably won't be able to play all of it, but it's kind of summarizing you know, what's going on in the world of code switching.
We all code switch, but some examples are more effective than others.
Okay, let's be real honest. Obama would not be president if he didn't know how to effectively code switch.
Obama out.
He's really adept at reading his audience.
Wagwan, Jamaica.
And then putting forth an American English that they can relate to.
So what is code switching?
Okay, so code switching, let's keep it really simple. Code, so we can think language, and switching, so going back and forth between one language and another, or one dialect and another.
Meet Professor Renee Blake.
I am an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at New York University. I'm also in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the Director of Africana Studies.
Say that 3 times fast.
Oh, you're funny. Code switching is the norm for all of us. So if you just think about whether it's a formal situation versus an informal situation, we're going to be code switching. Usually people think of it in terms of language. So here I am speaking, and I'm speaking not only with words, but I'm also speaking with my face, I'm speaking with my hands.
But code switching often has higher stakes for Black people.
I think it's clear why Black people specifically feel the need to code switch.
This is Taryn Finley. She's the editor of HuffPost Black Voices.
Our Blackness isn't accepted in a lot of spaces that are critical for our success and our survival. A lot of times we have to dilute and we have to put on a mask.
It's a bigger leap for someone who speaks African American English versus someone who speaks a language that is closer to mainstream English, the language of those in power.
But when a Black person can't.
So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to listen to all of that, but it was getting to the portion that, you know, when a Black person can't, or African American person cannot code switch, it often has very negative impact. In other words, they can get killed. And they get into some of the cases of that. They talk about Sandra Bland. Even though she knew how to code switch, it didn't help her in saving her life. So I hope you continue on this journey as we wrap up today's show, and take a closer look, whether you're Black or white. And when you start hearing these differences in how people are talking, hopefully you'll have a better understanding about that. So remember that the viewpoints expressed in the preceding program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. I do thank you for listening to the One Human Nation show. And as we wrap up and get ready for Troy Stoner with Sound Limits, I do want to remind you that you can email me at mystory@onehumannation.info if you want to share your story about race and racism or code switching and what that meant in your world. Or even if you're a white person, if you've been in an environment where you've been around more African Americans and all of a sudden the dynamics change as far as how the language goes. I mean, how did you feel? Did you feel a part of the conversation, or were you comfortable with it? And I think as we get more multicultural in our families, that dividing line gets less and less, because there's a comfort level there, because now it's your family. If you would like to hear about a particular topic as it relates to race and racism, you can send me an email at onehumannation.wruu@gmail.com. So as we tune out from today's show, get ready to listen to Troy Stoner with Stone Limits, and hopefully you continue on your race reconciliation journey and not be distracted by everything that's happening. I mean, it's important for us to be engaged in our communities and voting, but, keep your eye on the bigger picture. Again, thanks for listening to One Human Nation, and I hope you tune in next week on Thursdays at 5 Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks for listening, and have a fabulous evening and a good week.